The year is 1907. The United States is in the grip of a financial panic of the kind that the 19th century produced with a regularity that should have been embarrassing to a nation that considered itself the most dynamic economy on earth. Banks are failing. Stock prices are collapsing. Credit has frozen. Depositors are lining up outside trust companies in Manhattan trying to get their money out before the doors close permanently. The Treasury of the United States is essentially powerless. The President, Theodore Roosevelt, is in the South on a hunting trip and has no mechanism available to him to intervene in a financial crisis of this scale even if he had wanted to. There is no central bank. There is no Federal Reserve. There is no institutional architecture through which the government of the United States can inject liquidity into a seizing financial system. What there is a 70-year-old man in a brown suit sitting in his private library on Madison Avenue playing solitaire while the most powerful bankers and financiers in America wait in the rooms outside for him to tell them what to do. He has already decided what to do. He is making them wait because he understands, with the specific psychological precision of a man who has been managing the fears of other powerful men for half a century, that men who have been made to wait are more compliant than men who have been immediately accommodated. When he is ready, he will call them in. He will tell them how much money each of them is going to contribute to the fund that will stabilize the trust companies and stop the panic. He will not ask them. He will tell them. And they will comply, because the alternative is a financial collapse so complete that none of them will have anything left worth protecting. His name was John Pierpont Morgan. And the story of how one private citizen came to occupy the position of de facto central banker of the United States, the lender of last resort for the most powerful economy in the world, is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of American capitalism. It is a story about money, obviously. But it is also a story about character, about the specific kind of authority that personality can generate when it is combined with genuine competence and absolute self-confidence and the willingness to act decisively at moments when everyone else is paralyzed by the scale of what is at stake. And it is a story about the specific period in American history when the institutions that now manage these crises did not yet exist, and the vacuum they left was filled, imperfectly but effectively, by one man whose capacity for financial organization had no precedent and has had no real successor. John Pierpont Morgan was born on April 17, 1837, in Hartford, Connecticut, into a family that was already prosperous and already connected to the world of finance and commerce in ways that would shape his entire subsequent career. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a successful Hartford merchant who would eventually become one of the most important American bankers in London, a partner in the firm of George Peabody and Company that managed the transatlantic flow of capital between British investors and American enterprises with a reliability and a conservatism that made it one of the most respected financial houses in the world. The specific values that Junius Morgan instilled in his son, the absolute primacy of reputation, the conviction that a banker's word was his most valuable asset and that any transaction that compromised it was not worth making regardless of its short-term profitability, would become the foundation of everything that J.P. Morgan built. Pierpont, as he was known to his family, was a sickly child. He suffered throughout his childhood and adolescence from a range of health problems, including severe rheumatic fever that left him periodically incapacitated, and that gave him an intimate acquaintance with physical vulnerability that the imposing physical presence of his adult life was in some ways a permanent overcompensation against. He was educated partly in the United States and partly in Europe, attending the University of Göttingen in Germany, where he studied mathematics with a rigor that his later career in finance would draw on constantly. The mathematical mind that could hold complex structures of credit and obligation and risk in simultaneous focus, that could assess the financial condition of an entire industry at a glance and identify the specific interventions required to stabilize it, was built in part in the lecture rooms of a German university in the 1850s. He entered the world of finance in 1857, at the age of 20, working as an accountant in the New York office of his father's banking correspondent Duncan, Sherman and Company. He was not a patient apprentice. He had a quality that would define his entire career and that his subordinates would spend decades trying to manage around. He acted. When he saw a situation that required a decision, he made the decision, frequently without consulting anyone who might have told him to wait. In 1859, while working as an agent for his father's firm, he unilaterally purchased a cargo of coffee in New Orleans on what he judged to be favorable terms, without authorization from his principals, and then sold it at a profit before anyone could tell him he shouldn't have done it. It was the first of many episodes in which Morgan's instinct for the decisive unilateral action produced results that justified themselves after the fact in ways that made it very difficult for anyone to tell him to stop doing it. The Civil War made Morgan's first significant fortune, though not in ways that his later admirers found entirely comfortable to discuss. He was 24 when the war began, and like many young men of his class and connections, he did not serve in the military, paying the $300 commutation fee that the draft law permitted in lieu of service. More consequentially, he was involved in a transaction in 1861 in which he helped finance the purchase of 5,000 Hall carbine rifles from the federal government at $3.50 each and their resale back to the federal government at $22 each. The rifles were defective. The transaction was legal. The profit was substantial. And it established, in the minds of those who later examined Morgan's early career, a question about the relationship between his public philosophy of honest dealing and his private willingness to exploit the specific opportunities that institutional chaos and informational asymmetry made available. It was a question that his career would raise again. But it was not the question that defined him. The question that defined J.P. Morgan, the one that his entire subsequent career was an extended answer to, was simpler and more fundamental. In a country without stable financial institutions, without a central bank, without reliable mechanisms for the coordination of capital and the management of financial risk, what could one man with sufficient intelligence, sufficient capital, and sufficient force of personality actually accomplish? The answer, it turned out, was more than anyone had previously believed possible. And the process of discovering that answer would reshape the American economy in ways that are still visible in its structure today. The American economy in the decades following the Civil War was the most dynamic and the most chaotic large economy in the world simultaneously. The railroads were stitching the continent together at a pace that the existing financial system could barely keep up with. New industries were emerging, steel and oil and electricity and chemicals, at a speed that made the economic map of 1870 unrecognizable by 1890 and the map of 1890 equally unrecognizable by 1910. The capital required to fund this expansion was enormous, far beyond what the domestic American financial system could provide from its own resources, and a significant portion of it came from British and European investors whose willingness to put money into American enterprises depended entirely on their confidence that the people managing those enterprises were honest, competent, and financially sound. J.P. Morgan was the bridge between that European capital and the American enterprises that needed it. His father Junius's position in London gave him access to the British investment community that no other American banker could match. His own reputation for absolute financial probity, built through a series of transactions in the 1860s and 1870s in which he consistently prioritized the long-term integrity of his relationships over the short-term profitability of individual deals, gave European investors the confidence to place their capital in American enterprises that Morgan vouched for. And his growing capacity to organize and coordinate the activities of multiple financial institutions simultaneously gave him the ability to manage transactions of a scale that no individual bank could have handled alone. The railroads were where Morgan made his reputation as a financial organizer of the first rank. The American railroad industry in the 1870s and 1880s was a disaster of competitive excess. Too many lines had been built, financed with capital that the traffic they carried could not service, and the result was a cycle of rate wars, bankruptcies, and reorganizations that destroyed investor confidence and made the raising of new capital for legitimate railroad projects almost impossible. Morgan's response to this chaos was not to pick winners and back them. It was to impose order on the entire system. He began organizing what his critics called railroad pools and his admirers called rational coordination, agreements between competing lines to maintain rates and divide traffic in ways that prevented the destructive competition that was driving the industry toward collective ruin. These arrangements were legally dubious, ethically contested, and operationally effective. They stabilized rates, restored investor confidence, and made it possible for the railroad industry to raise the capital it needed to continue expanding. They also made Morgan the most powerful figure in American transportation, a position he used not just for profit but for the imposition of a kind of financial discipline on an industry that had been operating without any. The Morganization of the railroads, as contemporaries called it, was the template for everything Morgan did subsequently. When a railroad went bankrupt, which many of them did in the Depression of the 1890s, Morgan's firm would take over its reorganization. The existing bondholders would accept reduced claims. The existing shareholders would be largely wiped out. New securities would be issued on terms that reflected the actual earning capacity of the railroad rather than the optimistic projections of the original promoters. And a Morgan partner would typically sit on the reorganized company's board of directors, not to manage it on a day-to-day basis, but to ensure that the financial discipline that the reorganization had imposed was maintained in the years that followed. This practice of placing Morgan partners on the boards of companies his firm had reorganized or financed produced, by the early 20th century, a network of interlocking directorships that his critics described as a money trust, a concentration of financial power in the hands of one firm and its allies that gave Morgan effective influence over a significant portion of the American economy. The Pujo Committee, which investigated this concentration of financial power in 1912 and summoned the 75-year-old Morgan to testify before it, found that Morgan partners held directorships in corporations with aggregate resources of over $25 billion. It was a finding that shocked the public and confirmed the fears of those who had been arguing for years that one man had accumulated more economic power than any private citizen in a democratic republic should be permitted to hold. Morgan's testimony before the Pujo Committee is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of American finance. The committee's counsel, Samuel Untermeyer, was a skilled interrogator who had spent months preparing for the confrontation. Morgan was 75 years old, in declining health, and visibly impatient with the entire proceeding. And yet the exchange between them produced a statement of Morgan's financial philosophy that is as clear and as honest as anything he ever said publicly. Untermeyer asked Morgan whether commercial credit was not based primarily on money or property. Morgan said it was not. Untermeyer asked what it was based on. Morgan said character. The first thing is character. Before money or property or anything else. Money cannot buy it. A man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom. It was not a performance. It was a genuine statement of the principle on which Morgan had built his entire career. The belief that financial transactions were ultimately relationships between people, and that the quality of those relationships, the trust and the reliability and the predictability that they embodied, was more fundamental to the functioning of the financial system than any amount of collateral or contractual protection. This belief was simultaneously Morgan's greatest strength and the most uncomfortable element of his legacy. Because a financial system organized around the personal judgment of one man about whose character was trustworthy was not a democratic institution. It was a private kingdom. And the king, however wise and however effective, was answerable to no one. The creation of United States Steel in 1901 was the most spectacular single transaction of Morgan's career and the clearest demonstration of both his organizational genius and the scale of the power he had accumulated. Carnegie Steel was the most productive and most profitable steel operation in the world. Morgan wanted to combine it with several other major steel producers to create a corporation of sufficient scale to rationalize the American steel industry in the same way he had rationalized the railroads, eliminating destructive competition, stabilizing prices, and creating an enterprise large enough to compete with the emerging steel industries of Germany and Britain. The obstacle was Andrew Carnegie, who owned the majority of Carnegie Steel and who had no particular reason to sell it. Morgan approached Carnegie through an intermediary and asked what he wanted for his share. Carnegie wrote a number on a slip of paper. The number was $480 million. Morgan looked at it and said, "I accept." He did not negotiate. He did not ask for time to consider. He accepted because he had already determined that the price was within the range that the transaction could support, and because he understood that any attempt to negotiate would have offended Carnegie's pride in a way that might have ended the deal entirely. It was one of the most consequential decisions Morgan ever made in the space of approximately 10 seconds. The resulting corporation, United States Steel, was capitalized at $1.4 billion, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history, a figure so large that it required newspapers to explain to their readers what a billion actually meant. Morgan had organized the financing, coordinated the participating institutions, managed the legal complexities of combining dozens of separate corporate entities, and delivered the whole thing in a period of months. It was a feat of financial organization that had no precedent and that established Morgan's firm as the dominant force in American investment banking for the generation that followed. The Panic of 1907 was not the first financial crisis that J.P. Morgan had helped to resolve. In 1895, when the United States Treasury's gold reserve had been so depleted by a sustained run that the government was within days of being unable to meet its legal obligation to redeem paper currency in gold, Morgan had organized a private syndicate that provided the Treasury with $62 million in gold in exchange for government bonds, stabilizing the reserve and ending the crisis. Grover Cleveland, the president who had reluctantly accepted Morgan's terms after exhausting every other option, was deeply uncomfortable with the fact that the financial stability of the United States government had been dependent on the willingness of one private banker to provide emergency support on terms that the government had no choice but to accept. The discomfort was justified. It was an extraordinary situation. And it would happen again. The Panic of 1907 began in October of that year with the collapse of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the largest trust companies in New York, following the failure of a speculative attempt to corner the copper market. The collapse of the Knickerbocker triggered a classic bank-run contagion, as depositors at other trust companies, uncertain about which institutions were solvent and which were not, rushed to withdraw their funds simultaneously. The trust companies, which held deposits but were not members of the New York Clearing House and therefore had no access to the emergency liquidity facilities that the Clearing House could provide to its member banks, were particularly vulnerable. Several of them were on the verge of failure within days of the Knickerbocker's collapse. Morgan took charge. Not because anyone had appointed him. Not because he had any legal authority over the trust companies or their depositors or the New York financial system more broadly. But because he was the only person in the room, metaphorically and frequently literally, who had the financial resources, the institutional relationships, the personal authority, and the clarity of mind under pressure to do what needed to be done. He assembled teams of accountants to examine the books of the failing institutions overnight, to determine which ones were solvent but illiquid, which ones could be saved with emergency loans, and which ones were genuinely insolvent and had to be allowed to fail. He coordinated the contributions of the major banks and trust companies to the emergency funds that kept the solvent institutions alive. He managed the specific crisis of the New York Stock Exchange, which came within hours of being forced to close when its brokers could not obtain the call loans they needed to finance their positions, by organizing a pool of $25 million in 15 minutes from the banks assembled in his office. He locked the bankers in his library. This is not a metaphor. On the night of November 2nd, 1907, Morgan gathered the presidents of the major New York trust companies in his private library on Madison Avenue and presented them with the terms of the agreement that he had determined was necessary to end the crisis. The trust companies needed to contribute $25 million to a fund that would support the weakest among them. Morgan had decided how much each institution would contribute. When the trust company presidents proved reluctant to sign the agreement, Morgan had the library doors locked and told them that no one was leaving until the agreement was signed. At approximately 5 a.m, after hours of negotiation, the last signature was obtained. Morgan unlocked the doors. The crisis, within days, began to subside. The total amount of money that Morgan personally committed and organized during the Panic of 1907 has been estimated at over $100 million, drawn from his own resources and those of the institutions he coordinated. The panic was contained. The banking system survived. The economy, which had been on the edge of a collapse that might have matched or exceeded the Depression of the 1890s, pulled back from the brink. And the United States government, which had been largely a spectator to its own financial crisis, began the process of reckoning with what the panic had demonstrated about the inadequacy of the existing financial architecture. The reckoning produced the Federal Reserve System, established by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The intellectual foundations of the Federal Reserve were laid directly by the experience of 1907 and by the recognition that a modern industrial economy could not continue to depend on the willingness and the capacity of one private banker to act as lender of last resort in a crisis. The Aldrich Plan, which was the immediate precursor to the Federal Reserve Act, was developed by Senator Nelson Aldrich following a secret meeting of bankers and financial experts at Jekyll Island, Georgia, in 1910. A meeting that Morgan's associates attended and that drew heavily on the lessons of 1907 in designing an institutional architecture that could perform the crisis management functions that Morgan had performed personally without depending on the existence of another Morgan to perform them. Morgan did not live to see the Federal Reserve open its doors. He died on March 31, 1913, in Rome, where he had gone for the winter following a period of declining health that the stress of the Pujo Committee investigation had accelerated. He was 75 years old. He had spent the last months of his life under a cloud of public suspicion about the concentration of financial power his career had created, testifying before committees, defending practices that he regarded as obviously beneficial and that the public was increasingly inclined to regard as dangerous. He died, as he had lived, without significant self-doubt about the value of what he had accomplished, and with the specific dignity of a man who had decided very early what he believed and had never found sufficient reason to change his mind. The reading of his will produce one of the most commented upon surprises in the history of American finance. John Pierpont Morgan, the man who had organized the financing of United States Steel at $1.4 billion, who had twice stabilized the financial system of the United States at his own initiative and largely at his own expense, who had accumulated directorships and influence over enterprises worth tens of billions of dollars, left a personal estate of approximately $68 million. John D. Rockefeller, upon hearing this figure, is reported to have said that Morgan was not even a rich man. It was not entirely a compliment, but it was, in its way, an accurate observation about the specific nature of Morgan's power, which had always resided less in his personal wealth than in his capacity to organize and deploy the wealth of others in ways that they could not have organized themselves. The $68 million obscured rather than revealed the nature of Morgan's legacy. His art collection, which he donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and which became the foundation of one of the greatest museum collections in the world. His library, the magnificent building on Madison Avenue that now bears his name as the Morgan Library and Museum, housing one of the most important collections of manuscripts, books, and works of art in the United States. The financial institutions his firm had built and the industrial enterprises it had organized, which continued operating long after his death and whose organizational DNA bore the marks of his specific approach to the relationship between capital, character, and institutional trust. And above all, the Federal Reserve. The institution that was created precisely because one man could not be allowed to remain the indispensable center of the American financial system, but that was shaped in its fundamental design by the lessons of what that one man had done. The Federal Reserve is, in a very real sense, the institutional successor to J.P. Morgan. It performs, through bureaucratic process and monetary policy tools and the authority of the state, the functions that Morgan had performed through personal authority and private capital and the force of a personality so powerful that it could lock bankers in a library at midnight and make them sign agreements they did not want to sign. Morgan would not have been entirely comfortable with his successor. He believed in personal judgment in a way that made institutional process seem to him a pale and unreliable substitute for the real thing. He believed that character was the foundation of credit and that no amount of institutional architecture could substitute for the specific trust that existed between individuals who had established, through years of dealing, that they were reliable. He was right about that, in ways that every subsequent financial crisis has demonstrated. The institutions we have built to manage financial risk are better than having no institutions at all. They are not better than having J.P. Morgan. The problem is that J.P. Morgan only existed once. And the world he helped create, the world of billion-dollar corporations and global capital flows and interconnected financial systems of incomprehensible complexity, was a world that could not afford to depend on the existence of another one. He understood this, at some level. The man who had spent his career substituting his own judgment for the institutional frameworks that did not yet exist knew that his judgment was not transferable and that the frameworks, however imperfect, were necessary. He just never quite believed they would be adequate. And in the moments when they have proven inadequate, in the crises that the Federal Reserve and its successors have failed to prevent or contain, the ghost of the man in the brown suit playing solitaire on Madison Avenue while the bankers wait outside becomes briefly visible again. Not as a nostalgic fantasy about a simpler time when one great man could fix everything, but as a reminder of what the institutional architecture was built to replace, and of how much it cost, and of how imperfectly the replacement has always worked. John Pierpont Morgan died leaving a fortune smaller than anyone expected. He left a financial system larger than anyone before him had imagined possible. And he left a question that the institution built to replace him has been trying to answer ever since. What happens when character is not enough? And what happens when the institutions we built because character was not enough turn out not to be enough either? We are still working on that answer. We have been working on it since November 1907, when a 70-year-old man unlocked the doors of his library at 5 a.m. and the bankers walked out into a city that did not yet know it had just been saved.